Hello, everyone. Luke Blight here with part two, essentially, of the underlying issues within Ruby. And that topic for the day is going to be specifically the Faunus. Yeah, they're going to get one whole video dedicated to them as a whole. So, the first thing I want to say is that the Faunus are meant to be portrayed as kind of the discriminated against minority, the people we should feel sorry for, and such like that. However, I think that Rooster Teeth has missed the mark in a big way up until Volume 5, which the Faunus were kind of in a more protagonistic role as a whole, as a species, if you will. And there are two comparisons I want to bring up, and that would be the Ishvalans of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood and the original Full Metal Alchemist from 2003, and the other being the ghouls from Tokyo Ghoul, as kind of comparisons as to the narrative I feel that they should have gone with. So, in regards to Tokyo Ghoul, it's established that the ghouls are, they eat people, they kill people, and they aren't shy about doing so. However, as the story progresses, we're shown that both humans and ghouls are given the capacity to both be evil, essentially. And that is kind of a narrative that Rooster Teeth could have gone with, but is that explicitly shown or stated? Not really, but it is an angle they could have gone with, but unfortunately they didn't. We could have been shown that both Faunus and humans are capable of doing evil and dastardly deeds. However, I will contend in defense of Rooster Teeth and in defense of Miles and Carrie that Volume 5 did show us that, to an extent. Albeit it might be too little too late at this point. Now, on the other hand, we have the Ishvalans who were subjugated to essentially a genocide by the Fuhrer, King Bradley, in the war of extermination against Ishval because there was an uprising caused by, well, plot-related reasons that I won't get into. Now, initially, we are given the perspective of Scar, who is initially an antagonistic entity, but over the course of time, we come to realize that even the Ishvalans condemn him for what he's done. Similarly to how some Faunus condemn what Adam has done or condemn what Sienna Khan was doing at the time. And we also get to see that Scar over time warms up to the idea that what he's doing is wrong because his fellow Ishvalans convince him, and then he realizes that instead of trying to seek revenge, maybe I can change this country. Maybe I can show it that it's wrong, why it was wrong in the first place. So that's to give you some context on two different approaches that Rooster Teeth could have gone with, or Miles and Carrie specifically could have gone with in regards to the Faunus, instead of essentially having them portrayed as an antagonistic entity from volumes 1, 2, 3, to a lesser extent 4, and to an even lesser extent than 4, volume 5, in which the Faunus finally have their comeuppance, if you will. We actually have a reason to root for them as a species. So I want to first establish by saying that in the Blake trailer, we could have had the psychological aspects of Blake be the centerpiece of the overarching story we had in the trailer, in which Blake herself is in a dream state, if you will. She's experiencing a psychological change, and I'll get into what the psychological change would amount to in volumes 1 and 2, and to an extent 3 as well. And that is what Adam is doing in this trailer is essentially the embodiment of everything Blake sees being wrong with him, with his approach. Everything wrong with his approach, everything wrong with what the White Fang is doing. Like this didn't actually happen, but this will be the centerpiece for why she decides to enroll in Beacon Academy and become a huntress and want to protect people instead of, enforcing a racial agenda, be a part of an extremist movement that has really lost its morality, lost the path that it, was initially trying to portray, and wants to stay true to her principles as a person. So we have Adam essentially work with Blake. We establish that Blake and Adam, they're partners, they're compadres, they're close. And, we see that Adam protects Blake protects Adam, all that other good stuff that we see in the trailer. But when we see Blake cut the train and leave Adam behind just so that Blake rather could protect the crew members that Adam was intent on killing, that could be shown as Blake severing the ties that she had to Adam. but we wouldn't really catch that until the end, or actually even in the middle of Volume 2. So, as we all know, that Raven and Crow initially enrolled at Beacon Academy to learn how to kill huntsmen. Well, I want to flip the script on that and say that Blake instead enrolled at Beacon Academy to learn how to kill huntsmen because huntsmen were starting to become a problem because the Trinity Dust Company was starting to take notice at how efficient the White Fang was at taking out their supplies, their dust trafficking, etc. And so Blake is entrusted with enrolling at Beacon Academy to better learn how to combat these huntsmen that are becoming a problem. And Adam entrusted it to her because, well, A, she's the right age, and B, he knows her combat capabilities. And initially, Blake can be like, yeah, okay, I'm for this. But over time, through her bonds with Yang, Blake, RWBY, getting to know Ozpin, and even Ozpin suspecting her, and just her bonds with everybody else could be the turn of the tide that she needed to realize just how far gone the White Fang had become because she comes to bond with humans who don't view Faunus in a negative light. And so, through the course of Volume 1, she's conflicted. She's undecided, and we know that there's an internal conflict going on, but we don't find out about it until Volume 2, where Blake finally reveals herself, instead of it being Volume 1. And it could be in relation to the festival itself, where Sun shows up and, she comes to see as Adam is her darkness, whereas Sun is her, no pun intended, light in said darkness, because she's conflicted. She doesn't know what to do. But Sun is that shoulder that she leans on. And, I'm not deviating too far from the established storyline because Sun is, in fact, that role model. And Ilya could be as well as portrayed as she is in the current incarnation of the story, and that she is what Blake used to be. And in fact, I feel like with this approach, it would have been more strongly reinforced. And we could have had Blake as more of a, not necessarily anti-heroine or femme fatale, but as somebody who is really conflicted, has that internal struggle going on between Sun and Adam and their respective messages to her, because she does have loyalty to Adam because she cares about him. And perhaps in some way she feels like that he's just taking this drastic approach because he's desperate. The White Fang is desperate. And over time she comes to see like they're employing even more violence. They're employing violence to such a degree that it's actually working, and this would in turn terrify her. Because she doesn't want her fellow members of the White Fang or Adam to be subjected to this means of using violence for all time. She thought maybe it was temporary. And so you could have Sun kind of explain to her that, like, hey, this isn't the right way. Like, what the White Fang used to be, like, I was actually a supporter of it. And you could even have Velvet do the same thing, whereas, where you have Blake and Velvet bond together. Velvet being this innocent bunny, again, no pun intended, where she says that she respects what the White Fang represents, but she can't condone their methods. And so Blake starts to see that, like, not all Faunus are in agreement with what Adam and the White Fang are doing under Sienna Khan. And so that would lead us into Volume 2, where she actually actively tells people, namely Yang, RWBY, and Weiss, where she stands on the whole thing. And of course, we could have the whole Weiss versus Blake dynamic, and this is where Weiss, like, really just does not trust Blake, but over the course of time comes to accept that Blake is, in fact, on the right side of what will eventually become history. And so that could be an added dynamic for Volumes 1 and 2 instead of trapping it completely in Volume 1. Whereas, they had conflict in Volume 1, but Volume 2, that conflict seemed to dissipate entirely. So we could have it be something that works across. Whereas in Volume 1, it would be more of a Weiss doesn't trust Blake because Blake isn't as open as RWBY and Yang are, or as open as Nora and Ren are, or Jean for that matter. In fact, she thinks Jean is a little too open. And so you have that dynamic established in Volume 2 where Weiss just completely distrusts Blake, just doesn't want anything to do with her. And in turn, once Blake comes up with a plan saying, I want to save people, I don't want the Faunus and humans to fight one another. And Weiss eventually over time comes to respect that, and even herself comes to realize that maybe not all Faunus are bad people, especially with their interactions with Sun and Velvet. And so you have this whole dynamic of, the racist human and the semi-racist Faunus coming to terms together, like two of the most opposite ends of the spectrum coming together with a common goal, and that is stopping the violence that is further dividing Faunus and humans. And thus you have something similar to what Tokyo Ghoul and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood / Full Metal Alchemist from 2003 have. That is, you have Ishvalans working with Amestrians, you have ghouls and humans kind of seeing the same side of the coin that they're a part of, and in this case, you have Faunus and humans working together to stop a fanatical group. And in turn, you could have maybe not necessarily more major Faunus characters, but Faunus in general be introduced to further alleviate this, saying that not all humans agree with, the treatment of the the treatment of Faunus. And likewise, you have Faunus who don't agree with the violent methods the White Fang employs. And so I feel like this would be a more relevant approach than constantly having the Faunus portrayed as the antagonistic entity that, while on one side, are being manipulated by Cinder and company, and by further extent, Salem. But you would at the same time have the violent side of the Faunus portrayed as well as the non-violent side of the Faunus portrayed before we even enter Volume 5. Volume 5 could have been where these two differing ideologies collide together. And so with that said, you would have Sun being Blake's light, and Velvet, by an extent, also being the innocence of the Faunus that, they're just people too. They just have, different features. Some have ears, some have gills, some have fins, some have feathers, etc., but at the same time, they are still people. Whereas Adam he can't differentiate between the two. And Blake, just needed the right people, more specifically, to listen to her, to tell her that, hey, not all humans are bad people. And she comes to realize this through getting to know Yang, like more specifically Yang. Yes, I'll side with the Bumblebee shippers here in that regard, and saying that Yang is the real centerpiece here. Ruby's innocence helps her out, and Weiss's realization that not all Faunus are bad people, as well as Ren and Nora being, we don't see Faunus or humans in any kind of different light, and to a even lesser extent, Jean coming to her and saying like, hey, you may be a Faunus, but I still consider you a friend. That helps bind the main 7 characters together. And yeah, you could have Pyrrha in there, but it was already established that Pyrrha was, pro Faunus right. She was all for equality. She didn't see anybody different from anybody else. She felt that individuality was a thing. And, she judged each person based upon their individuality as opposed to lumping them together in a group or a clique or whatever the case may be. And so that brings me to the heart of the point I'm trying to make here in regards to this part 2 of the underlying issues within RWBY, and that is that the Faunus haven't been... They're made to be sympathized with. They're made to be, we're supposed to feel sorry for them. We're supposed to be shown the discrimination against them, but let's take a gander, if we will, at Atlas, who actually has a Faunus in one of their teams representing them in the tournament. And Atlas is supposed to be the worst of the worst offenders, whereas from what I can tell, Vacuo is supposed to be one of the ones where it's like, if you can make it in Vacuo, then you belong here. Like, you belong in Vacuo if you can survive here, but yet Vacuo's 2 teams that we had, Indigo and Bronze, had not a Faunus to be spoken of, whereas Atlas had at least one portrayed. And Mistral itself also had one in the form of Sun, and of course Beacon was pretty much portrayed as being the neutral party in the grand scheme of things. Ozpin was sympathetic, Port was sympathetic, Ooblik especially was sympathetic, and from what we could tell, Glinda, Crow, and all them, they seemed to accept Faunus altogether. They didn't have any sort of racial tendencies towards Faunus versus humans, or anything like that. And so, with that said, we don't really see this discrimination. And yes, I will give credit where credit is due. The sign in Mistral in Volume 5, where Crow visits the bar looking for, I believe his name was Shiro, we see the sign that says, no Faunus. And yet, Mistral has a Faunus headmaster. So it kind of creates this weird topsy-turvy type environment, where it's like, well, on one hand, yes, Faunus are discriminated against, but on the other hand, they are a political entity. Now, that's not saying that it's immersion breaking, because, back in the when the civil rights movement had finally gotten its way and African Americans and other minorities had their equal rights, there were politicians and people or public figures and whatnot of minority descent that were currently occupying office, but I wouldn't say that they had anything major going for them in terms of enforcing political change within a position of political power. They were instead public speakers that gathered a movement that encouraged people to speak out their minds, and in turn, they got that equality by appealing to the powers that be, as opposed to being a part of the powers that be, which makes Leo being a Faunus headmaster within Mistral seem a little immersion breaking, but not totally destroying it completely. Because at the same time, he is portrayed as the Cowardly Lion, so the role fits him. It fits him perfectly. It's just the location could have been, I guess, handled a little bit better. But again, that's a very, very minor complaint on my end, a very minor one, as opposed to the grand scheme as a whole, and that is the Faunus portrayal in volumes 1, 2, and 3, where, if we're being honest here, we saw more Faunus than humans die. We saw more Faunus portrayed as antagonists than protagonists. And we saw them being easily swayed against their own principles and their own beliefs for the sake of, oh, we got to show the humans that they're wrong. So if you're supposed to portray them as a sympathetic entity, aka the ghouls and the Ishvalans in Tokyo Ghoul and Full Metal Alchemist respectively, you could have had something along the lines of those two approaches, or you could have had one similar to what I just said. And so I feel like the underlying issue still remains within RWBY that the Faunus are not portrayed in as a sympathetic light as possible. And with my previous video, you could illustrate it even further, where Menagerie is kind of a dump. It's people are content because they have their families, they have their friends, they have people they care about that they can bond with, share a drink with, and that they can all just live a life of relative peace without getting discriminated against, dirt thrown at them, or anything like that. But at the same time, it's not something they should truly settle for. It's not something any self-respecting person would settle for, and Blake's son, Gira, Kali, and all them would be trying to convince the majority of the population there that we can do better than this. We deserve better than this. We shouldn't be at the heels of humans. And you could, on the contrary, portray humans living a life of luxury and Mistral. And I feel that would hit the nail on the head far better than just, oh, there's a sign where a bar says, hey, no Faunus allowed. And you don't have to have outright, oh, you dirty Faunus, or, racial discrimination directly stated from one person to another. You could simply have it shown through the different societies of Menagerie and Mistral, but we didn't get that. So I felt like the point was, it was hit home with a single sign, which is more than what we've had in the previous 4 volumes, but you could have had it be a bit more subtle, something we could observe in the world that we were watching. And, if we're going for this whole world building argument, then that would be the approach I would have taken. And I'm not trying to tell Miles and Carrie how to write their story or how to do their job. I'm telling them that, hey, if you really want to hit the nail on the head, you need to show it. You don't need to tell us it. You need to show us it. Because if you show us through these subtle, not even verbal cues, we can establish it for ourselves. We can see where the underlying issues are within society, and that is Faunus living in a decrepit ghetto that's just, held together through bamboo sticks and bare minimum plumbing and just, food that's barely edible, whereas people in Mistral would be living a life of luxury. They would be gambling. You could even have them doing some tournaments with like Faunus gladiators or just gladiators in general. Just living a life of debauchery up there. That alone, you wouldn't even need to say a word, and we could figure out that Faunus are getting mistreated, whereas humans are living a life of debauchery. And to me, that just would have hit the nail on the head. I keep using that phrase. I need to come up with new phrases, but at the same time, I feel that the point stands. So, this, I will say, or I'm going to end this on a note saying that Volume 5 definitely made me feel more sympathetic to the Faunus than I have in the last 4 volumes. Now, is it too little too late? In some areas I would say yes, but in others I would say not really. The problem, of course, is within the villain himself, Adam, not really being portrayed as a villain to be contended with, because he was kind of overcome rather easily, which I felt robbed a very important moment for Blake as well as for Adam. it was underwhelming and it could have been done a lot better, but I will go into far more detail with that with my actual Volume 5 review after I upload a couple more parts to the underlying issues series with RWBY. So, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I've been Luca Blight, and this has been part 2 of the underlying issues with RWBY. If you have dissenting opinions, if I've got something wrong, by all means, let me know. This is an open discussion between you, me, and whoever else wishes to chime in. I'm not saying that I'm completely spot on perfect in my analysis or my criticisms of RWBY. I just feel that there is a better approach that could have been handled in volumes 1, 2, 3, to an extent 4, and of course volume 5, although I will contend that in terms of Faunus representation, volume 5 did rather well for itself, to the point where I would say I would keep it as is, barring the conclusion in episodes 13 and 14. So that said, folks, I'm Luca Blight, and have a wonderful evening.